I'd like to call on the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We got a lot of discussion, but still a relatively small amount of information about the engines themselves. Like each one of you to just swag what you think each one of these engines would be worth on the market.
It's hard to say, but I would say if you were trying to launch that payload or that class of payload, whether it's 1,200 pounds or 1,200 kilograms or 1,500 kilograms, what would it cost on a commercial variant of that vehicle? And I'm guessing that that variant would probably be in the $30 million neighborhood. I think the motors would be about in the $30 million vehicle.
Okay.
The motors would cost about $30 million, I believe.
Each?
So, each.
Okay.
But I think certainly if you go forward, a detailed cost analysis would have to be in place to see what the actual cost is, what the government cost, what they should be charging, things of that nature.
Yeah.
What'd you do?
Votes, okay. Congressman, thank you for the question. I would associate myself with Eric's remarks in terms of detailed cost analysis being required. We don't like to speculate, and if we were asked a question and had time to answer, I would task my research experts with talking with the Air Force about what they're willing to sell for, talking with customers about companies about what they're willing to pay, and try and come back with some kind of a figure. I just have no idea at this time.
Well, it is so hard on the Hill to get a yes or no answer out of anybody, much less a good guess at a value, and I really do appreciate you swagging that for me, and it just gets us in the ballpark. Would either one of you care to comment on the percentage of cost of the launch vehicle the engine is? So if you have one of these engines, you have 50% of your program ready to go, 33, 25, what do you think?
Again, Congressman, it's an interesting question because each of these vehicles has different attributes. If you look at what Virgin Galactic is doing with Launcher 1, their entire first stage is an aircraft, and so their model is fundamentally different. I just, it'd be different for virtually every launch vehicle, I think.
I think in the category of launch vehicles we're talking about, though, I think it is significant. It is the motor. I mean, you certainly need the guidance systems and the payload fairings and everything else, but certainly you build a rocket around the engine and the motors.
Yeah.
So, but I'm not an engineer. I'm a poli-sci guy, so I would stick to the experts on that. But if you're asking me for a WAG, I would say it's a significant portion of the rocket on this type.
Well, I'm figuring that they would probably like to have the whole rocket. What would the payload be on one of the ICBMs that we're talking about accessing?
The size of the payloads?
Yes. Weight of the payload. I
believe that the payload range is anywhere from 500 kilograms to about 1,500 kilograms. I think that's a rough estimate because it falls in the medium-sized payload area. It's whereas a Falcon 9 is a little bit larger. A Falcon 9 Heavy is extremely larger. What Virgin Galactic and Firefly are looking at are a smaller payload and the less than 500 kilogram payload, maybe about 300 kilogram payloads.
Yeah. So the question is, if I could just buy one of the ICBMs, take out the current payload, now I own it, what would the market demand be for the 500 to 1,500 range payload?
Well, that's the challenge. The market demand is high for that, depending on how you use that payload or that rocket. So, for instance, just recently, I don't have the exact date, but a few months ago, SpaceX launched the Orbcomm constellation of satellites, and they basically bundled, I believe, 11 satellites, and then they dispensed these satellites out. So if you aggregate the payloads, it ranges. If you're just looking for, to use this launch vehicle for one payload, a 1,000-kilogram payload, then there you go. There may be a market for that. I'm not sure of what that mid-class market is. But I know mostly what we're talking about now, when you're talking about a much larger market, you're talking about the geostationary market, which is a lot large, or it's very stable. We know almost exactly what that will be and who will be launching it. With these smaller satellites that are going up, these smaller constellations, and I have a graph I could share with you, and the breakdown of the weight and the
I
size.
saw it in the talking points. I like that.
Yeah.
And I was thinking like OneWeb.
So OneWeb will probably, what OneWeb is looking to do right now, and they have already aligned of their 700 launches, they're going to go with an Ariane space launch vehicle, as well as augment with some of these smaller aggregation with Virgin Galactic. So the Virgin Galactic will maybe launch, a handful of satellites at a time, where the Ariane variant can launch a much larger amount because it's larger payload. And I think Elliot has a chart on that.
Yes, Congressman. In my testimony, there's a chart from our research folks that shows from 2006 to 2015 the breakdown of various masses that were launched. And in the area that we're talking about, the medium, 501 to 1,500 kilograms in 2014, just eyeballing it, it looks like it was probably 13 or 14% of what was launched, and in 2015, probably only about 9 or 10%.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Mr. Posey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Still trying to quantify the potential values and potential uses of our potentially expendable ICBMs. Is there anyone in the industry who uses the same motor now?
I do not believe so. I believe that Orbital ATK is a subject matter expert on solid rocket motors. I could be corrected on that, but by and large, the majority of folks in the launch industry use liquid motors. So Orbital is the one. Orbital ATK are that. And again, I'll check for clarification, but I believe if they aren't, there's not that many others. So, okay. But I believe they are the only one.
And I was interested really in domestic, because I don't want them to go overseas.
Right, yeah, of course.
By any stretch of imagination. A little while ago, you talked about the United States having 100% of the commercial launch market back in the 80s. And then I missed the last part of that sentence. We managed to parlay it into what?
So the U.S. changed their policy. The U.S., the commercial launches, and then we changed the policy to go onto the shuttle. And then after the shuttle happened, during that time frame, a lot of the Arianespace emerged to take up a lot of those commercial launches because of the limitations that the U.S. launch companies had. So the U.S. government was still launching, or we still were launching government payloads, but as far as commercial geostationary satellites, we were at zero. And that has recently changed, I think, with the emergence of SpaceX. I think in 2010 we started beginning to capture a larger amount of the market share. And right now, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that we have 60% of the geostationary commercial marketplace.
Okay. Yeah, my recollection is a little bit differently. I think we lost the commercial market because we overregulated it, while other companies subsidized and actually helped their industries. We choked a golden goose, and I think we managed to do that. I don't think there was ever a necessity for an Ariane if they had left our commercial launch vehicles alone and let them do their job without trying to fund federal agencies with what should have been value-added, or actually were non-value-added cost to our commercial launch market. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.